And we are at the narrowest part of the province, right? So if you're traveling from anywhere that's out on the shore to the Bay of Fundy and to New Brunswick, this is the narrowest part of the province.
The area was called Pisiquid, and that's a Mi'kmaq term for the joint junction of two waters. And it really referred to the where the St. Croix River joins the Pisiquid River, which is now called the Avon River.
There was always an area there that was referred to as Indian Orchard. I used to think, well, was there some orchard there? But the term was used to describe a land of plenty of where the waters converged for fish and hunting and berries and fruit and wildlife and everything, you know, along that line.
We found at the head of the tide, they would gather there in the summertime to fish the migrating population.
It was the only way through the valley. It was the only way to cross the Avon River. You had to cross at Castle Frederick. There was no other way to cross that tidal river, especially in the wintertime.
Mi'kmaq society and culture during this period is very well established and very sophisticated. And I think it's important to understand that the Acadians are coming into the context of Mi'kma'ki and into the context of a pre-existing settlement patterns, population, infrastructure, and so on.
They were French settlers from the coast of France. And as the population developed in Annapolis and up through to Grand Pré, they began moving into this area in about 1680.
So it seems that they came, they looked around, they said, okay, well, where else are there great marshlands to dike? And so they end up in here in Falmouth. We noticed that a few years later, they're showing up on the other side. So they're in the St. Croix sort of area and Martox.
And there were all sorts of place names that spoke to an earlier presence on the land before the New England planters, and they included the Old French Road, French Orchard Hill, Willowbrook Farm, the Old French House, the Old French Mill, Battle Hill. There were all of these place names that you would never find on a map.
And of course, they came here because of the marshlands, which they had the technology to recover those marshlands and turn them into agricultural lands by using dikes and what they call arbutos.
Come on, Don. We'll have it good.
By the time they settled Pisiquid, they're certainly very familiar with their surroundings, with the environment, and with the people who are already here.
So they established good relations with the Mi'kmaq, which is huge. The Mi'kmaq, of course, this is their land, this is where they live, so they're friendly and they're open to people who treat them with respect. And so generally it grows early from a good place.
They came to these areas in Pisiquid and they built their homes very similar to, you know, carrying on the traditions that had come from their fathers and mothers who were in Port Royal.
They would recover small pieces at a time, and it would have to lay fallow for a couple of winters to get the salt out of the soil, and then they could grow their agricultural products on it.
The Acadians didn't just have subsistent farms, they actually had industry. And the one guy, Pierre Landry, that we still have the basement there, he's located where the river comes into the upland without any marsh. The first crossing of the Avon was up here was because when the tide's in, the river's 2 miles wide.
Right.
Right? And so they had to go up to where the tide stopped and cross the river up there. And then the highlands are so rough, they couldn't go directly through to the next rivers. They had to come out and then across. They had to really come out to where the Landrys were. in order to get across to the next river.
And so this would have been prime real estate.
This would have
for
been
the
prime
Landry
real estate.
family
Yeah,
coming in.
yeah.
And they would have lived in relative peace from outside influences.
The territory changes between the English and the French from one treaty to another 7 times in the time that the Acadians are here.
There was very little English presence in this area and very little French government. So the Acadian settlers were left pretty much on their own. The only real contact that they had would be through the priests and the missionaries.
The Acadians develop a really distinct sort of society.
Until 1750, when Fort Edward is built and the British come, and once the British are here, everything changes.
From then on, both the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq were seen as, if not enemies, suspected. As a result of that, a fair amount of guerrilla warfare broke out between the English on the one side and the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians on the other.
There was always the stories of some scrimmages that took place crossing the Avon between English and French. Apparently there was a natural rock formation that was up the river that you had to pass through to get back out into the valley, or even go further up the valley because the highland was too rough. Oral history says that the Acadians used that somewhat as a fortification or an opportunity to defend land resettlement. Where the tide stopped back here.
I'm in a little village that goes back to the Acadian time with the marshes and the history that went with the actual expulsion of the Acadians. What I was familiar with was the old cellars that were left from their habitations and the folklore, a bit of it that sort of went with the final end of them in that area.
The English population was all in the Halifax area at that time. There were no settlements outside of Halifax and a small settlement in Annapolis Royal of civilians. Fort Edward was established here in 1750 with really 3 objectives. One was to control the road between the new capital of Halifax and the old capital of Annapolis Royal. It was also to guard the junction of the St. Croix and the Pisiquid River. It actually is strategically located on a hill overlooking that junction. And the third was, to use a good old English term, to overawe the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq through military power.
There's certainly good evidence to suggest that the Acadian Parish Church of l'Assomption was torn down to make way for the blockhouse, which was built in 1750.
And now if you're in Windsor and Falmouth, you're like, okay, so this is getting really close. The British are here. They've moved it from Annapolis way over there to right here, Halifax, Chebucto Harbor. Now they're putting a road from us to there. There's a fort. Now our church is gone. Now we have a fort. Now we have soldiers around. Now we have to supply them with wood. Now they're watching everything we do. Do we really want to stay here?
Life went on from 1750, and Cornwallis, the infamous Edward Cornwallis, after which the fort is named, by the way, went back to England. And his place was taken by Lawrence. And Governor Lawrence took it upon himself, for many reasons, to rid himself of the Acadian settlers. He did that by deporting them. At Fort Edward, the Acadians were gathered together, put on ships, and sent to primarily Maryland.
But we also know that there were Acadians like Some of the Thibodeau family who did not wait for the deportation order to come down, they left by choice and by necessity and went to Ile Saint Jean several years before 1755.
So when it happens here, the people that are still here in Windsor, in Falmouth, they get called to the Fort Edward for September 5th at 3 o'clock. Same exact thing as in Grand Pre. The doors are closed and they're read the order of deportation. Then they're held prisoners until the boats arrive to take them. Out of 14,000, over 14,000 people altogether, more than 6,000 were deported. There were still some leftover people that didn't get deported, and that total is around over 3,000 people.
The last Acadian holdout was, as I understand it, where we call the head of the tide in Windsor Forks. The Acadians had retreated, and they had retreated back up to this little valley at the head of the Avon Valley, and they were encamped there. Now, the British had been unable to dislodge them. They organized a raiding party, picked the tide time that would deliver them to the head of the tide where this encampment was at daylight. And so they didn't even have to row. The tide took boats and everything up there. As I understand it, they did surprise the Acadians. A fight ensued, and the army were able to drive the Acadians back along the foothills of the South Mountain through Windsor Forks. The Acadians gave up, they hid their muskets and surrendered. Now that would be the end of the Acadian occupation.
If you look at things from the perspective of a person who's living through it, little bitty details that a historian might have said, like the Acadians were in prison camps. They were hiding out in the woods. And so, yeah, okay, fine. And then you see the detail that most of the children that were born died because the mothers didn't have the milk. They were in refugee camps. They were hiding out. They didn't have proper nutrition. They were emaciated themselves. Most of the babies that were born died.
It's quite amazing to think that we're standing, though, in Pierre Landry's house. Like, it's the fact that it's still here, relatively undisturbed, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
And that we can look out onto the formerly known as the Pisiquid River, now the Avon River,
Yep.
And see, you know, a very similar landscape to what
Really hasn't
he and his
changed.
family
Yeah, really hasn't changed much, I don't think.
It's just a remarkable experience.
Yeah.
The deportation occurred in 1755, but in 1763, the Acadians were allowed to return. And this was driven primarily by Lieutenant Governor Franklin, who actually lived here in Windsor. So the Acadians were allowed to return, but their farmland was gone.
In the meantime, the land was all surveyed and the lots laid out.
And so the offer from Nova Scotia ultimately was taken up by people from primarily Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island.
And the particular area where I am at Windsor Forks was all allotted to Halifax families.
And we know that when the planters came, particularly into the Newport Township area, that in many cases they moved right into existing buildings.
There were a couple of things that the English did to accommodate those settlers. One was to set up townships really in the way that the New Englanders had their townships set up for as far as governance was concerned. The farmers in this area were making a lot of money off the British military.
And the orchards at Castle Frederick were not used to produce fresh fruit. They were used to produce cider. And the cider was sold to the British Navy.
And significant amounts of it.
Significant amounts of it was sold to the British Navy, I guess, as a prevention of scurvy.
The other was, although Washington in a letter said that he would not invade Nova Scotia, the privateers did. And the privateers raided the very people they're trying to entice to join the other 13 revolting colonies. That annoyed the settlers here quite a bit. So they ultimately didn't join. The British decided that they better do something about Fort Edward. They were concerned that an American party could come up the St. Croix River and attack Halifax from the land side. So they rebuilt Fort Edward for the same reason that they built it in the first place. Then the War of 1812 broke out, and it was brought up to strength again. But that was the last time that it was used for military purposes. They were building ships, they were manning ships, they were shipping around the world. They had insurance companies, banks, the whole thing.
So they were made of softwood, and from the time they cut the wood in the winter until the first snowfall, again, they were gone, built and gone. So it was a remarkable experience, the numbers that were built. I know that something like 53% of them all came to a sticky end. And it really is a harrowing thing to read the final call. Shipwrecked, lost without trace.
Vanished South Atlantic, wrecked Santo Domingo, broken up, sold to Norwegians, wrecked Cape Breton coast, lost Bay of Fundy.
I mean, on and on and on and on and on and on. I think the seamanship was probably pretty shaky. One of George Mounce's great uncles didn't know how to navigate. And what they did, and it's a well-known story within their family, he'd get out to sea and they'd finally try to close enough to another ship and hail them and say, "Where the hell are we?" basically. And they would tell him.
And my father remembers just as a kid being in the horse and wagon going out by the wharf and it all being lit up at night by gas lights because the lumber came in a overhead sluice that came 6 or 7 miles from the mill in a stream of water, and it came down to the wharf and it was taken apart and then piled. The men piled these big piles of lumber.
And then loaded in barges. The tugboat had a stack on it that hinged and tipped down, and when he came to the bridge, he turned his stack down, went under the bridge, and then put it back up.
Early agriculture would have been very little livestock and a lot of hay being exported and a lot of apples. Most of the upland was orchard. Some farms would have some livestock. And then as that hay market died, then what do you do with the hay? You put it through livestock to convert the hay to a product that you could sell. Orchards still occupied most of the upland. There was a big connection with Windsor, Fort Edward, and that old exhibition is a big piece of history It's the oldest agricultural fair in North America. It's been going since 1765.
In October of 1897, Windsor had a huge conflagration fire.
At the time of the fire, Windsor was a prosperous town, and they had a lot of, I suppose we call them today, industrialists. There was a lot of manufacturing going on here. There were insurance businesses here, banks here. Everything was quite local.
Down on the waterfront in the wee hours of the morning, in October, two gentlemen were on the waterfront in a shed. Somehow it's believed a lantern got kicked over, the shed caught fire, and then the waterfront was on fire. So the fire department, with their 38 men by then, came on scene and did their best to put it out. In the course of doing that, it was just about out, the wind sprang up, huge gale force winds, 50, 60 mile an hour winds from the northwest, and proceeded to ignite the fire and send embers. And in those days, a lot of the roofs were wood shingles. It wasn't asphalt shingles as we have today. And so anyway, the fire spread right across town. Many of the citizenry tried to save their valuables, taking them out into the streets. Many stories about pianos burning out in the middle of King Street. If you could imagine trying to lug a piano out into the street when you're in a panic. The whole town was on fire. 38 men tried to battle that blaze with a couple of hose wagons, a few horses, and some very limited amount of hose. So 2,000 people were left homeless. And it was in October. There was a blizzard that occurred overnight and the next day. It was total devastation and very, very tough times for the people in the community.
And they had the wherewithal to rebuild the town.
What kind of spirit did those people have to wake up one morning and there wasn't a home, there wasn't a business, and to have the courage to try and scrape enough money together to stay here and rebuild?
Around 1924, there was another big fire in Windsor. Just about all of the King Street burnt. Fire started at the Hants wholesalers down on the waterfront again, and again, big wind came up, about 50 mile an hour wind, and blew the fire up across King Street, where many homes and businesses were burnt, most primarily large 2- and 3-story homes. Again, by today's standards, we would call that a big fire and call in mutual aid. The Windsor Fire Department then was probably 40 or 45 men, and they did the best they could with the equipment that they had. But again, they kept evolving. Every time there was a big fire, new equipment was purchased. So yes, we've evolved from surround and drown, doing the best we could, and protecting other properties, to an aggressive interior attacks with better controlled ventilation, better fire hoses, better breathing apparatus, better training, how to work as teams to put out a fire.
Both my great-grandfather and my grandfather took part in the Riel Rebellion. My great-grandfather was Colonel J.J., and he was the commander of the 66 militia in Halifax, and they were sent to the west to secure the supply lines. His son, my grandfather, he went in the fall of 1884 and joined the Northwest Mounted Police. He was a guard of Riel whenever he was captured, I guess in the summer of 1885. And I've got a card signed by Louis David Riel on the 15th day of November 1885, and I guess he was hanged on the 16th day of November 1885. Louis David Riel card, Regina, November 15th, 1885. It's in a box that was supposed to be a piece of the rope that hung Riel. My great-grandfather returned to Halifax and was very well received. In fact, there's the gate, the big iron gates on the public gardens are in memory of my grandfather and the Halifax battalion that went west for the Riel Rebellion. But my grandfather stayed in the west, in the Northwest Mounted Police till 1892. Did some other things until the First World War broke out. Well, let's say there would be Bremners, Lawrences, Davisons, Smiths, Pattersons, Sangsters. You know, offhand, that's the ones that I would remember. My grandfather said that if you're going to party, you should take a Patterson. If you're going to war, you have to take a Patterson.
And at least 3 battalions were trained here for overseas service. The 112th, the 120th, and the Jewish Legion.
Guard, slope, march.
In commemorating the laying up of the colors of the 112th Battalion, we also remember today all those who have given their lives in the service of Queen and Commonwealth.
They were made up of Jewish immigrants, primarily from Boston, New York, Montreal, who wanted to fight in the First World War against the Ottoman Empire in Palestine.
In 1917, the British War Office approved the raising of a Jewish military contingent for active duty in Palestine. This Jewish fighting force, which included the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 42nd battalions of the Royal Fusiliers, would become known as the Jewish Legion.
They were originally slated to be trained at Halifax, but the Halifax explosion occurred, and there was so much of the city wiped out that they were brought here for training.
Among the Jewish soldiers that underwent basic training at Fort Edward were David Ben-Gurion and Itzhak Ben-Zvi, later to become the first Prime Minister and second President of the State of Israel, respectively. The evidence that I've seen would suggest a fairly positive relationship between the local townspeople of Windsor and the Jewish recruits for the Jewish Legion. So we have some anecdotal evidence and we have some archival documentation, all of which seem to paint a picture of a very welcoming and supportive town.
We have a picture of a big celebration that was held here in 1918, celebrating Yom Kippur.
Which was said to be the largest Jewish army since the time of King David. That's pretty impressive.
The Imperial Recruiting and Training Depot at Fort Edward proved to be the venue in which Jewish soldiers from various countries and walks of life came together for the first time in a military context to pursue a Jewish homeland. For Ben-Gurion, who had become Israel's first prime minister in 1948, his training at Fort Edward was never forgotten, exemplified in a letter he wrote in 1966 to Robert Dimmock, then mayor of Windsor.
In 1966, my dad wanted more information on the formation of the Jewish Legion in Windsor, and somehow he was able to contact David Ben-Gurion himself in Israel and ask him of his memories of his time in Windsor. And he got this delightful letter back.
In that letter, Ben-Gurion writes, "In Windsor, one of the great dreams of my life, to serve as a soldier in a Jewish unit to fight for the liberation of Israel, became a reality. And I will never forget Windsor, where I received my first training as a soldier and where I became a corporal."
And accepted the mantle of leadership.
Well, our stories of World War I are simply mostly around my grandfather, who was second in command, and he also was adjutant. There's also stories of the big fire burnt from the West Branch and clear to Pontic Lake, that my grandfather brought troops that were in training, or some of them, out here to help to protect the homes, and they were billeted here. And David Ben-Gurion was in that group and actually was billeted in this house. Well, they couldn't really fight that fire. They just had to kind of control it or steer it.
So to try to put out a forest fire in those days was a humongous big job.
And one of the fire hazards would be a great big old individual spruce tree that would be standing way up above the canopy. Now the fire didn't have to come too awful close to that, and that thing would burst into flames. Just the heat would burst into flames. My father always showed me a friggin' stump. Now a stump in the woods, if it's in the woods and in the shade, will last 100 years, right? He said, David Ben-Gurion cut that tree down. Took him all day, because he didn't know how to cut. You know, he just went round and round it like a beaver, and the stump was still shaped like there had been a rogue beaver had cut this tree off.
And you said to me one time he was like a brilliant world leader, but not much of a woodsman.
He didn't put that on his resume.
Little personal details about Ben-Gurion, only to be found at Castle Frederick.
After that, the the fort really was no more. A lot of the buildings were allowed to deteriorate. The officers' quarters was burned in 1922, but by the grace of God, the blockhouse still remains intact. It's said to be the oldest blockhouse in Canada. I think it's the oldest blockhouse of its kind in North America.